Hello, everyone. Welcome to Writing Quest. My name is Brennan Pugh. Today we have Josh Walker with us. He has a new book coming out here soon called An Exile of Water and Gold. And so we're going to talk to him about his process. We're going to talk to him about this whole self-publishing thing. So how you doing today?
Yeah, really good, Brendan. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. So, and you're over in Australia, right?
Correct. I'm in Melbourne, which is in the south of the country. It's super cold at the moment, but it's a nice sunny day, which is awesome.
Nice.
It's actually a bit of a rarity at this time of year to get a lot of sunlight, but yeah. So just kind of working through the winter at the moment. It's a good time actually to kind of sit back and write. So I've got
Yeah.
that going for me, which is nice.
Yeah, we're opposite. When I talked to Jonathan
Oh yeah, Jonathan
Weiss,
Weiss.
yeah,
Yeah,
I talked to him, and I obviously know that you guys are going into winter, but I hadn't really like thought about that because we're in summer
yeah,
right now. So today was like almost like on 95 degrees push Fahrenheit for us,
yeah. That's hot.
but
That's hot. Yeah.
it's getting kind of hot. So my poor puppy dogs outside were like just not having it
Oh
today.
no.
Yeah,
What kind of dogs do you have?
I've so we live out in the country, so I have a Great Pyrenees Anatolian Shepherd mix. So he's like a big total
Big boy.
outside
Yeah.
dog, like just country guardian dog, but he's like 160 pounds. He's like a huge,
That's
behemoth.
awesome. That's
Yeah.
awesome.
Yeah.
I've
He's
got a
awesome.
Samoyed, so I'm used to having a long-haired dog. My dog hates the summertime as well.
Yeah. Yeah. He
Mm.
sheds like in the, when we get out of winter into summer, like, I mean, we're like buckets of hair off of him because he just sheds so much. Yeah. Well, cool. That's awesome. So, why don't you tell us a little bit about how you got into this, when you started writing, where the inspiration came from, kind of that whole beginning journey thing?
Yeah, for sure. So I've been writing well, I mean, I've been writing since I was a kid, basically. But in terms of kind of trying to go pro, I probably started kind of grinding away at that around 2017. And back then I was actually writing novels and querying. And it ended up I did okay, I think, in terms of getting in touch with agents, and I was getting some fairly good feedback from them as well, which was a big motivator for me. Um, but I think I kind of hit a point where I just wasn't sure whether the trad industry was going to give me what I wanted, which was the ability to, I guess, be in control of the art that I was making to the fullest capacity. So I ended up making the decision to go indie, partly inspired by well, the big inspiration for me was Ryan Cahill, who I was reading kind of back when his second book came out, which was Of Darkness and Light. And around that time, I also kind of reached out to him, joined his beta reading list, and started to learn a lot. I think about how what his process was like, and listening to him talk on interviews and things. Um, it was a really good look at the benefits of indie, and that's when I started to kind of open my own mind up to reading more indie as well. Um, and I guess kind of from there around 2019, 2020, obviously COVID came. My muse, so to speak, hit a wall for probably a good year, but I got back into it in 2021, and then I wrote my current series in 2023. So I wrote another couple books before that that kind of just didn't really work. And then the book that's coming out this September, I wrote last year, punched it out in about 8 months, and now it's going through some pretty hefty edit rounds. But it's as it stands, it's in a really really good place. So I'm just excited. Like I feel like I'm in control. It's obviously very busy. Like you're wearing a lot of hats,
Hmm.
but at the same time, if you look at it as a benefit rather than I'm wearing a lot of hats, then there's actually a lot to kind of reap from the process.
Yeah. Yeah. That's my wife and I are small business owners. So yeah, I totally get that. Like the small hat, you're wearing a ton of hats, but it's like that's a benefit. I mean, it can be a lot and it can feel like a lot, but it's definitely in the long run, I think, of a benefit. And what you're talking about too is like, I think that's probably the number one thing I've heard from everyone I've talked to is
Mm.
just being in control of what they're creating. And, a lot of them, like you said, like did kind of went down the traditional path and then we're like, didn't like, that they weren't in control of as much as they wanted to be. And so, yeah, I think that's awesome.
Yeah, I think like it's one of those tricky things where, trad still has a lot to offer people, but it's a mindset thing. Like for me, I think I prioritize the amount of control that I've got over my art more than, I guess the alternative mindset, which is like I'd like to sit at home and write and let everyone else do all the other stuff for me. I think I'm just too much of a control freak to let that stuff go.
Right.
Things like being in control of my cover art or the way that I format or how I choose to distribute and things like that. That stuff is important to me nearly as much as the actual story itself.
Hmm.
And so that's kind of why it's worked out that way. But I think obviously both kind of takes are valid and both paths are really viable for people if they're willing to put the time and the energy into it.
Hmm. Yeah, I think it just depends on who you are. I think, for me, like I'm like you a lot, where it's like I like being in control of the whole creative process. You know, especially because, like, I don't know about you, but I do a lot of things. Like, I edit videos. I like to do some graphic design. So not that I'm necessarily like amazing at any of those things per se, but I just like to have some amount of control over it, I guess.
Oh, I completely get that. I'm a bit of a hobby freak as well. So
Yeah,
I've been brewing beer for about 10 years, and that's a really big hobby of mine.
that's
And it's
awesome.
good because it kind of engages the scientific part of my brain, which is a
Hmm.
great way to change things up from writing. But I'm also a musician, and I've done that kind of for years as well,
Yeah,
audio production and songwriting and stuff. So like these kind of facets of my mind just don't lend themselves to people jumping in and kind of speaking over the top a little bit. I mean, yeah. So yeah, I get it. I completely
yeah,
get it.
yeah. I'm. My wife calls it creative ADD, is what she says I have.
Yeah,
So I'm just
yeah,
like, my first response whenever I'm like, I need to get a cover artist, I need to get a this, I need to do that, is like, well, I can try that. Like, that's always my first
yeah.
response. But like you, I'm also a musician. That's kind of where I did the whole music thing for a really long time and still do a little bit. Um,
Nice.
so that's always been like if I was ever like, I want to put a little soundtrack together, but like, well, I can write the themes
Yeah,
to that, and like, so yeah, I'm with you 100%.
that's awesome, man.
Yeah. So maybe we can talk a little bit about some of your writing process. So, how did you go about this? So, I saw you have a novella that's kind of a prequel to this. I'm assuming a prequel. And then,
Yeah,
how did you outline a lot? Do you like to just kind of write it, see where it goes? Like, what's your kind of process for creating?
yeah. That's a really, it's a really good question because so with the novella, I didn't actually know I was going to write that novella. Um, I finished writing an Exile of Water and Gold and sent it off to beta readers, and I had about a month, I guess, to kind of not write anything and take a break. But my creative obsessive mind couldn't let go. So I essentially ended up writing the novella, and it was, I guess, it was a bit of an investigative story for me, for a few reasons. So one, the novella's main character, in many ways, like represents, I think, myself and the way that I think about the world. So it kind of became quite a personal project. But then at the same time as that, um, I played a lot with my writing process for that novella, and it seemed to work in my favor. I think because it's a shorter text type,
Hmm.
but it's very locked down to one character's point of view. There's no other point of view in the story. The thing about the novella is that it's written in alternating timelines. So essentially, there's there's two kind of timelines that are 50 years apart, focusing on the same character, and they kind of come to a head in terms of the climax of the story. Each timeline has its own climax that somehow interfere with each other at the end of the book.
Hmm.
Um, and it was a lot of discovery, right? Which like I like to outline. I kind of see myself as a bit of a mix of like a pantser and a plotter, in the sense that I like to know where I'm going. I'll tend to still have a chapter by chapter scaffold as well, but it's not super in depth, so I'll
Hmm.
leave things open for me to kind of figure out as I go. But the novella for me was actually a way to try to figure out some of the history and the lore of my world. And what that's done is it's actually now helped feed back into Exile in the editing process. Like I've been able to take that knowledge and like kind of reapply it. Um, so yeah, it's a bit of an interesting one. Like Exile was written completely differently. That was like chapter by chapter, super rigorously following the outline, trying to make sure that I hit the story beats, um, trying not to blow out past kind of 150,000 words and trying not to go too far under that because I wanted it to be an epic fantasy. So, whereas the novella was really just let's just play around for a few weeks. And I ended up writing that in 2 weeks. It just kind of vomited out of me.
Hmm.
The other thing with the novella, it was actually already in a pretty good place at the end. Weirdly enough, like usually I find I have to do significant rewrites at the end of a draft to kind of pull everything together and tie off the threads. But with the novella, I actually sent it off to some beta readers and an editor, and they were all like, "Yeah, well, this is pretty much good to go."
Hmm.
So that was cool to see as well. And I'm not sure whether that again is just because it's shorter, so there's less room for error, or whether it's because my process was completely different, and it was more of a personal writing experience for me.
Yeah. Yeah, I think there always has to be like I've started out. I'm definitely more of an outliner. I like to know where I'm going. I like to plan things. I like to world build. No, like it's hard for me to just kind of like if I don't know how the magic system works, it's hard to like just go with it for me. But
Yeah.
at the same time, there definitely has to, I still think, be a moment of discovery writing. Like even if you're a big outliner, like I've always like I'll start writing and then as I write, I'm like, oh, this is maybe makes more sense for the magic system to work or this culture to work or whatever it is. Um, so it does seem like there always has to be that little discovery writing time, but I like knowing where I'm going for sure.
Yeah,
you know, yeah.
absolutely. Yeah, I think for me, it's like I like to know where I'm going roughly, but I still want to be able to play in that sandbox a little bit. You know what I mean? It's like you've got a sandbox. It's like that thing, like, the video game analogy. Like, I don't write like Skyrim. I don't write like there's endless kind of things that can unfold in front of me. I
Yeah.
write more like a sandboxed, more of a linear kind of story, but there's still room for me to play around within those confines.
Hmm.
Interestingly, like I find a lot of writers um, think differently about this, but knowing the ending is one thing that I haven't really needed to know.
Mm.
So oftentimes my ending will change once I've written it through once. Like I'll write it through once and then I'll be like, actually, I should probably like end it on a completely different note, and I'll go back and redo that. And I haven't heard of that happening often with
Yeah.
people. Um, so that's something that I've noticed about my own process, which is I think a little bit different. Um, but yeah, other than that, yeah, chapter by chapter structure for me just works. Like, and it just like I think it also just it inspires confidence in me that I can actually get the job done. Do you know
Hmm.
what I mean? Like,
Yeah.
there's a bit of that like that trepidation of like, oh my goodness, I've got 150,000 words right in front of
Yeah.
me. How am I going to do this? And breaking it down into that structure firstly lends itself into a way to go forward.
Yeah. I've even went so far sometimes as I don't do this for everything, but it kind of depends on like if I'm struggling to work out a scene or something or a chapter. I don't know if you've seen Abby Emmons' YouTube channel at all. Probably
Oh
you
yeah,
have. She talks about breaking scenes up into like five different parts. So it's like setting or setup, tension, uh shoot, I'm gonna forget what it is. There's like a couple of different
yeah. She kind of follows
segments.
the story mountain for like each individual scene, so that
Yeah.
at the end you've actually got that kind of rising and falling tension for the story as a whole.
Yeah, and I found that really helpful. Like I said, I don't do that for every scene in chapter, depending on how much I feel like I know about what's going to happen. But sometimes if it's a really difficult one, and I'm like, I don't know quite how I'm making this matter, that's been
Yeah,
really helpful to like, I'm just going to write the setup of this. Let's just write the setup, and then write the tension, write each part, and then go back and kind of make sure that they flow correctly, if that makes sense.
yeah. I think you actually make a really good point there. Like, if you look at a chapter is kind of it's kind of a self-contained story, right? Like it
Yeah.
needs to have not only a beginning, middle, and end, but it needs to have a conflict in and of itself that is resolved or left hanging at the end to
Hmm.
carry the reader forward to the next scene. So I think if you break it down like that, it's a really good way to kind of apply a little bit of formula to the story process without turning it into a beat by beat kind of thing. You know, like
Hmm.
there's something to be said for the way that, you know, screenwriters write television episodes where they follow that kind of save the cat beat by beat writing process
Hmm.
because it works. But at the same time, I kind of resist that a little bit just because I feel like it's a way to suppress the art making process if you stick too closely to that.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, so you kind of have to find that balance, and every writer kind of does it their own way.
Hmm. I like to start with it helps my creativity a little to like start with a structure. So like 3x story structure, whatever, be like, I'm just gonna kind of use this as a beginning framework. But then
Yeah,
as it goes, it just kind of like because I think it helps what it helps me do is make sure that I got that stuff in there. So like make sure I'm hitting the plot points that actually make the story effective. And then
yeah,
eventually I can rearrange it or do whatever. But it just is it's like a checklist of like make sure that you have this climactic moment in there, you know?
yeah, sure, yeah. And I think that's another really good point because not only does it mean that you get to tick those boxes, but you can also go back through it in your revisions and look at it and go, like, have I actually nailed the brief? Like, have I actually thought about the themes that I wanted to inject when I set out to write this?
Hmm.
Are they there? Like, is the subtext right? You know, because I think arguably sometimes we forget about the importance of those supporting details of the subtext or even the context. I guess if you're writing historical fiction, for example, but like all of this stuff has its place. It's not just the active plot that matters.
Hmm.
Um, Even though readers might not necessarily be looking for said theme or said subtext, a lot of the time they're subconsciously taking that in while they're going on the journey. So like we need to be equally as aware of that in the process as well.
Hmm. Yeah. And even like I find that I have to go back and like work on my outline when I start. This happens occasionally where it's like you're writing a scene and all of a sudden you're like, I don't even know what I'm writing here. Like, what are we going? What are we
Yeah,
doing? Like, what's the purpose of any of what, I just wrote 4,000 words and it's like, none of this matters at all, And that's where I find it helpful to have that checklist of like, does this have enough tension? Does this have a decision? Does it have, all those elements?
yeah, for sure. I think actually, you know, I'd love to know what do you use like a writing software when you write?
So I've gone a lot of different ways. I mostly have primarily used Scrivener. I do
Okay,
like
same here.
Scrivener. Um, you can do a lot of cool. I like how you can break things up and everything. Which quick little shameless plug: if you use the code Quest at checkout, you can get 20% off using the link in the
Oh,
description.
nice.
So throwing that out there
That's a great
for
deal.
anyone watching. But yeah, I like Scrivener. I've used Ulysses a little.
Hmm.
That one was fine. I didn't really care too much about that. But recently, what I've been doing, I do a lot of outlining in Notion. So I basically built myself a template in Notion
Yeah.
to keep track of my notes. But I've actually been doing a lot of handwriting. So I've been writing my notes, like writing in a notebook,
Ah, awesome. Yeah,
just
cool.
to mostly because I like all of my work, everything I do is on a computer or phone or whatever. So it's just
Yeah.
a way for me to like cut out all that distraction and I can just sit down with a notebook and write.
Yeah, that's a really great thing that you've got going then. Because like I mean, I think a lot of times we undervalue or at least underappreciate like the transmission of thought to paper, you know, in some ways best transmits via the pen. You know what I mean?
Hmm.
Like the pen is an extension of your mind, right? Like that's kind of like that classical Greek idea behind writing good stories or creating art in general. Like the brush is an extension of your hand, which is an extension of your
Hmm.
mind. So, like you know, I think Neil Gaiman actually says a lot about um, handwriting as well because he's pretty big on that. Um, I love some of the technology that's coming out around that too. Like I've been really eyeing off the I think it's called Remarkable, the tablet.
Yeah. Yep.
Yeah, like that looks so cool to me.
Hmm.
That's something that I want to try at some point. At the
Yes.
moment, I've mostly just been typing, but I have handwritten in the past, and it was really cool. Like it was a great experience.
Yeah. It's definitely slower, like you, but I think that's to my benefit because
Yeah,
a couple things happen. It's slower, so I'm actually thinking a little more about the words I'm putting down. Like sometimes you type and you can do backspace as much as you want. So you keep typing and
yeah,
then you're like, I'm gonna delete all that or keep But when you're handwriting, it's like you can't it's pretty hard to like I'm gonna go erase a whole paragraph. So I found that I think more about the words that I want to write. So I feel like I end up with a slightly better draft,
yeah,
you know? And then it also, I kind of feel like I remember more of what I wrote. Like it's a little more embedded in because sometimes what'll happen if I write on the computer is like, after you write 20,000 words over a couple of days, I kind of forget a couple of the details. Like, oh, what did I write in that earlier? Whereas with
yeah,
handwriting, I feel like it's a little more embedded. Um, but
yeah.
I
Okay.
have I have been interested in trying Remarkable. I also been looking at getting a free write. Have you seen those?
No.
So
Oh,
it's
okay. Hold on. Is that like the little computer? It's like a keyboard with like a tiny screen. Is that?
yeah,
Yeah.
they have a
Ah,
couple of
yeah,
different models, but it's just like a
yeah,
keyboard with a e-ink to screen
yeah.
on it, and then all it does is you just type. Like it's just for drafting.
And you can only like I think you can only see like one or two lines of what you're
Hmm.
typing as you go. Yeah.
Yeah.
See, like, I think stuff like this is really great because, as you said before, like handwriting kind of helps you formulate arguably better considered prose, right? But also, um, not being limited by distraction will enable you to, I guess, unlock a little bit more like natural stream of consciousness. So you start to work out like who you are as a writer, like what your voice is. I think
Hmm.
you work out you can kind of finesse it a little bit more. I think through that process, but
Yeah.
as you say, obviously it does slow the process down.
Yeah.
So I guess there's pros and cons to all of this stuff, but I would absolutely love to go back to doing some handwriting at some point.
Hmm.
Um, but yeah, it's difficult because like once you get used to typing, it's like, well, this is fast. Like I've figured my process out. I'm doing it quickly. My momentum is keeping up, so everything seems to be working. So something like the free write might be like a good kind of middle ground because you get that typing experience, but you're not limited by distraction.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's cool. I might have to check that out.
Yeah, I would recommend to any writer to like just try some handwriting. Like even if it doesn't become your main mode, or like a great way to do it probably would be like if you're writing your main story on Scrivener or whatever, but if you have like a short story idea, do that on a notebook. Just give yourself like that break, for doing it. What I've heard about the free write is it's really great for like your first drafts, like where you're just
Yeah,
like, I just need to crank out the words. We're trying to get the first version of this done because you can't really edit it. You can't like go back very well. It's kind of like handwriting where you can't. It's hard to go back and edit and stuff. So yeah, I'm really interested in getting one of those.
and I think that's another argument for handwriting is that once you've done that draft, when you actually sit down and start typing it up, like essentially what you're doing is your first round of serious revision, right? So
Hmm.
it's kind of cutting out one part of the process there in some ways. A lot of people don't think about it like that. Like they think, oh man, I've got to handwrite it and then I got to type it up and then I got to edit it. But it's like, well, if you type it up, that's your first edit. Like you're going to
Hmm.
consciously edit it as you type.
And
So
you can make as you're typing it, you can take notes. So like
exactly,
so when you're writing it the first time, you don't really have to think too much about taking notes. And then when you go back and type it, as I'm typing, I'll be like, oh, we need a little more description here. We need a little more of this here. And so it gives you like that second pass of like, even if you're not changing that much about it, you can kind of process it, I guess.
yeah, that's super cool. I think one of the like walls that I ran into with an Exile of Water and Gold is I kind of realized I sent it off to my editor at the start of this year, and she kind of pulled me up about 50K words in, and she said, "Look, I'm gonna stop here. The book has like a ridiculous amount of potential, but I need you to basically fix the start for these reasons." And I went back and did basically a very, very big overhaul of the first kind of 50,000 words. essentially just rewrote them,
Hmm.
restructured the full beginning of the novel, rethought the inciting incident. Like a lot of the tension between the characters completely changed, and then that obviously kind of funneled through and affected the rest of the story.
Hmm.
So I think sometimes like things like that could be avoided by slowing down the drafting process just enough, you
Hmm.
know. Whereas I did really just kind of vomit the first draft out, and I think one of the challenges, especially with epic fantasy, is you've got world building, you've got continuity to think of, you've got in world lingo, how the magic system works, like all this stuff that exists, I guess beneath the glacier, right? If you ever heard Brandon
Yeah.
Sanderson talk about the glacier of like author knowledge versus reader knowledge, like all that stuff
Hmm.
beneath the water is like the stuff that we're trying to like keep a handle on. Um, and it affects what the reader's seeing up here. So that's one of those things where I think like the drafting process could be slowed down sometimes. I'm
Yeah.
I'm super quick.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Well, so there's a question for you. How do you keep track of all that stuff? Like do you keep it all in Scrivener? Do you have other notebooks? Like what's your because that's probably the hardest thing about writing epic fantasy is like
yeah,
there are so many details and there's so many details that like you were saying with the glacier of like the author knowledge is vast compared to what the reader's going to know, and I've found like keeping track of all that it can be really tough. Like I basically feel like I have this like little half of my brain is like just knowledge about my story because
yeah,
you know what I mean.
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, look, unfortunately, I'm a little bit scatterbrained. Like I've got random notes in my notes app on my phone, or I've got like, I'm at work, and I'm a school teacher, so I'll be at work, and the kids are doing something, and I'll just like quickly write something down on a Word document and then email it to myself, so that I don't
Right.
forget. But I find it really difficult to get all that stuff into one place, just because sometimes I'll forget that I even wrote the note until I go back and find it later. So,
Hmm.
but Scrivener has been super helpful for this. So, having I really like having like a side by side view. So in Scrivener, you can have one chapter open, and then you can
Hmm.
have I have my chapter by chapter outline in the research binder, and that's open on the side, and I've just kind of got it there as a constant reference. And then in each chapter, you've also got a notes tab that you can open up and display as well. So my notes tab will be open with, future editing considerations. Like, if I want to change something later, but I don't have the time to kind of think through how to do it now, I'll just make a quick note, go back and look at this later. And then when I do my revisions, I'll see that note and go, oh, yeah, thanks,
Hmm.
past Josh, like that kind of stuff. Um, so, like, Scriven has been awesome for that. Initially, with this series, I actually tried to do a lot of the like deep world building through Campfire, which was like my first experience with using Campfire, and it was mostly more of an exercise to try the app out. I think it's got a lot of potential, but I think for me, it's a little bit too prescriptive. Like it's like there's just so many ways to organize things on that app, and it just didn't work for me. And I ended up yanking a lot of that stuff out and just
Hmm.
dumping it into a research document on Scrivener. And to me, it did the same thing but better because it's just in one place. So I think like everyone kind of has to just figure out how it works for them. I've had ongoing discussions about this with like a lot of my author friends because I know people that like write in Docs, right? Like and like Docs is like Google Docs is super powerful because you've got the benefit of being able to just like pick up your phone on the work commute, right? And
Hmm.
and write on there. But like at the same time, it just doesn't have a good enough like organizational system, I think, for me. Like I wouldn't want to be going, tabbing between multiple documents all the time. It's just, yeah. So Scrivener is the best for that because it's kind of just like a home base. You've got your manuscript, you've got your research, and it's just like, it just makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah, it's that like weird line. Like I love like looking into new tools and stuff. I've looked at Campfire. It's kind of been on my list to like mess around with. I've pretty much always come back to Scrivener. I've done a lot of stuff messing around with Notion. I've even built some Notion templates that I have available like for people to download and use.
That's super cool.
Yeah, like there's a lot of cool stuff out there, like Ulysses, Bear. Like there's all these awesome tools, but there's like that fine line of when does the tool become the distraction?
Yeah.
And that's where
Yeah.
like if something like Campfire, like again, it works for different people, depending on who they are.
Yeah.
But it's like I jumped into Campfire and was like, "Oh, there's like a lot." Like learning the amount of time it would take me to learn the program, you know, is a lot. Do I want to spend
That
that
was
time
exactly
doing
my
it?
problem.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's
So,
nearly like it's nearly like playing like a real-time strategy game.
mhm.
In order to then like know the plot of the story. Like, it just like I can't invest time in that. I just want to write the story.
Yeah. Yeah, and then I've always found like so I have quite a few notes and I've got stuff in my Notion stuff and every time I sit down to like I'm gonna write out all this stuff about this character, like I have it all in my head. So then I start typing it out, and like the act of typing it out seems just silly to me because I already know the
Hmm.
answer. So yeah,
Hmm.
it's kind of that again. It's like, am I wasting time by typing it out, or should I, I don't know.
Yeah, I have this problem all the time. Like this is why I am so scatterbrained. I've got stuff in so many places because like a lot of the stuff I can just retain. Like the base important level stuff will
Mhm.
stay. But the finer details where, if I come up with um, a new plot device, or if I finally figure out why this I don't know, why this point of conflict like can be exploited at a later point in the book or whatever, then like that's like a fine detail that I do not want to forget,
Mhm.
because it means that potentially I'm not going to write it as well without that knowledge. So that's the kind of thing that I'll write down.
Mhm.
But it's just so easy to keep in one place on Scrivener. Like, and I've had people say to me before, "Oh, but like if I have to learn Scrivener, then it's taking time away from writing." But Scrivener is super intuitive. Like to me, it basically is a stripped back word processor. It just allows you to have multiple documents open in the same window. Like
Yeah.
that's kind of how I look at it. And like if you look at Scrivener on Windows in particular, you'll see how this works because a Scrivener file on Windows is actually just a folder
Yeah.
containing all your subdocuments. Like on Mac, it's one file that's compiled, but there's no
Mhm.
difference, right? Essentially, it's
Right.
just an index of stuff you need. So you know, that's really why it works for me.
Yeah, I pretty much always end up coming back to Scrivener. Like anytime I've gone out and explored something else, I always end up
Yeah,
coming back to it, and it's a great program. Like they just really nailed it, I think.
yeah, absolutely. And I think like there is some really good potential for it to grow, but um, like I've got like a second kind of I run on a desktop computer, um, but I do have like a second like cheapy old Mac that I will take with me when I go into state to see my family or whatnot, so I can
Yeah.
work on the go. And so Scrivener can sync with Dropbox, which
Mhm.
it's not as seamless as something like Google Drive, but it's pretty good. I just make sure that I'm in, backup, 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 so
Yeah.
that nothing goes wrong, and you're usually pretty sweet.
Yeah, I even have it on my phone. So like if
Yeah,
I've had instances where I'm like, I don't know, at the mall or something with my family, and then all of a sudden I'm like, oh, I thought of a thing, like, and I can just
yeah,
put it directly in there. So yeah, it's pretty cool.
yeah. It's nothing
S-
like the cloud.
Yeah, gotta love the cloud or the building of servers somewhere.
Yeah,
So with your stories, so this it says book one on the cover, so I'm assuming it's a series.
yeah.
So do you have a lot of that planned out, or is it like you're not really sure how long it'll go? Do you know it's going to be a trilogy or 5 books or whatever, or like how in depth are you on that?
So again, this I guess this kind of goes back to where I sit as a pantser versus a plotter, but I know that it's going to be 3 or 4 books. I just don't know how many yet.
Hmm.
Um, I know the general ending to the whole thing, and I know mostly what's happening in book two. So for me, it's like if I get to the end of book two and it looks like I can't feasibly get to the end of the whole thing that I've got in mind, then I'll fill that out. Um, but I would like to get it done in 3 books because I think a 3 act story structure tends to work better.
Hmm.
I know some people have made counter arguments to that before, and I think there's enough evidence to suggest that maybe like a quartet or longer can actually tell a better story in terms of structure. But at the same time, I don't want to like I don't want to fill like a third book with like fluff
Yeah.
and have it kind of suffer from that middle book syndrome thing. And I know that book two is going to be pretty action packed and fast moving. So I'm hoping that therefore, if I have to write four books, the third one will be able to recover, or at least maintain. But yeah, ideally, I'd like to get it done in three. Um,
Yeah.
but again, like one of the problems with me as a writer is I just don't like I've got an outline, but it's not super rigorous, and I don't like holding myself to an outline like that closely because I feel like it limits what I can do. Like what I feel like it limits a little bit of the potentiality of what the story could become if I just suddenly, you know, get a second win one day and go, oh geez, this actually is better or whatever. I don't want to feel like I have to adhere to the boundaries that I've created all the time. So I'm trying to, you know, find my footing in both worlds, I guess, so to speak.
Yeah. Yeah, my story's really ballooned a lot. So I have about 13 books that I've got in my head. And basically what that's become is like I have the first one and the second one pretty well outlined, but then I have all these
Nice.
like notes of like, okay, this event happens and this needs to happen, and like so the rest of them are just kind of this like list of, well, this happened in book two, so I need to probably like that's got to come around book four or something like that. And so I kind of have that. It really has gotten out of control, if I'm being honest.
13 books though, that's awesome.
Yeah, it's. I hope I can get it all done. I'm really excited about it, and it's very like over many, few thousand years. So it's
Yeah,
the way I broke it up in my head is there's like four trilogies, kind of four
yeah.
main trilogies, and then there's like a last book that kind of ties the whole thing together.
Oh, that's a really cool idea.
Yeah. So I don't know. Maybe I'll get it done. Who knows? We'll
Let that
see.
excitement carry you.
Yeah. I'm excited about it.
Yeah,
It'll be fun.
yeah,
Yeah.
that's awesome.
So then so you have this series you're working on. Do you have ideas for other series that you want to get to eventually, or continuations of this? Like is there like another version,
Yeah.
some other section of it?
So I'll take you through my like mindset as a reader a little bit because it affects a little bit of my plan. But when I was I guess like a younger reader, one thing that used to be a pet peeve of mine, and it's probably somewhat irrational, is a writer would finish like a series, and I would love the series. You know, it'd be awesome. And then a year later or 2 years later, they've signed a new publishing deal, and it's about the children of the heroes in the same world, and I'm just immediately turned off. Like,
Mm,
I just like to me, it's like, well, how can this be better? How can this
yeah.
be better than the first time you showed us this world with the first characters? Like, it just can't be better. Like maybe you'll refine your writing a little bit, but the world is going to be the same. There's nothing new to show us. So part of me is really resistant to like stay in world. Um, Having said that, like going on the writing journey for this series now, there's so much that I can do with it, and I love that. I love that feeling of being able to move around within the world and just find more stories to tell. Like I think
Hmm.
that's super cool, and I've seen like Brandon Sanderson does this to effect incredibly well. Like if you look at Mistborn, um, and the way that kind of captures this dark kind of medieval style, like gritty fantasy storyline, and then it moves into like like the noir, like cowboy kind of like vibes
Hmm.
of like era two. That is just so awesome, and it feels like it's got a through line because the magic system and the world are the same, but time changes things, right? And
Yeah.
the impact of time is super interesting to me. So I would probably like to do another series or two in this world, but I would really want them to be chronologically far away
Yeah.
from this series, whether it's future or past, rather than like a generational thing. That's
Hmm.
just me though. Like, I think if you're very intentional about it, you can make anything work.
Yeah.
Um, so, as an example, Peter V. Brett, I don't know if you've heard of him. He wrote
Mm.
a book called The Painted Man. The series is called The Demon Cycle. It's fantastic. It's one of my favorite series ever. He's writing a new series now, which is actually about the children of the main characters. And initially I had a bit of that like, ugh, I don't know if I want to read it, but man, I read it and it was so good. Like he's just like, again, like set out with intention to write a generational story, and it's just worked.
Yeah.
So I think, you can make anything work. So that's kind of what I'm thinking. Is, yeah, having something that's chronologically very distant from the main series, and continuing with it for a little while. But I do want to tell a lot of other stories. Like I've got one story, well, one series that's kind of mostly planned out, that's inspired by Polynesian history and culture, which has been just like a hyper interest of mine since I was young. Like
Hmm.
I've just loved everything about. I don't know why. I've just always been super interested by Polynesian culture and the idea of voyaging and the way that they've moved from island to island over periods of, thousands of years. I think it's just so cool, and
Yeah.
there's so much to be done with their culture and their spirituality and stuff in a fantasy setting. So that's something I'd love to explore. Um, yeah, I want to write like a fantasy horror series as well, which I've semi planned out. So I've got these ideas that are kind of gestating in the background all the time, and
Yeah.
it's about kind of tackling them, I guess, at the right time. Like I want to, instead of writing like a 10-year plan, I want to say, here's all the stuff that can fit into the 10 years, and when I finish a book, I can look at it and go creatively, like where am I at? Like which one's going to work the best for me to write right now? Which one am I the most excited by? Which one do I have the right experience to tackle, etc., etc.
Yeah.
So yeah, I guess I'm fairly fluid in that sense. Like I'll take it as it goes, but I've got enough ideas, which is good.
Yeah. Yeah. I think I like how you kind of differentiate it between like, I think the reason the generational thing, if you continue a story, kind of turns people off, because I'm kind of, I like, there's a lot of those that I do like, but it's also like, I think it's like the low hanging fruit. It's
Yeah,
easy to go, well, we'll just continue with the kids of this character because you're kind of banking on people having that familiarity and fondness for the old characters.
yeah,
Um, I think that's what they tried to do with Star Wars in the sequel
yeah,
movies, and which that's a whole can of worms,
yeah,
so we don't have to go into. But
yeah,
I think the reason it didn't work is because they banked too much on that, as opposed
yeah,
to spending your time writing good characters regardless of who they're attached to. You know, whereas it's like
yeah,
what you're saying about Brandon Sanderson, he's taking, it's the same world, but it's not necessarily the same characters. It's not necessarily like he's just continuing the story in that world.
yeah,
And
yeah.
I've often thought it'd be really cool to like, I'd love to see someone write a fantasy. So like imagine like, and I've not read your story, so this is just me guessing, but imagine you
That's
write
okay.
your this book and then you wrote a book in the same exact world, but it's like sci-fi in space, like thousands
Yeah,
upon thousands of years later. Like that would be really cool. Like I want to see that, you know?
yeah, yeah, absolutely. Like that's something that I've thought about doing, is actually going back like a few thousand years and doing
Mhm.
like an early establishment kind of storyline, and then going super far forward. And again, like something that I'm really interested in seeing how it kind of rolls out is the next era of Mistborn, which
Mhm.
which is going to be um like a sci-fi, right? So like
Yeah.
that's, well, not the next one. I think the next one's actually going to be like 1980s style, but the one after that that kind of closes the Cosmere, from what Brandon said, is going to
Yeah.
be like this epic sci-fi story with like,
Which is so
um,
cool.
fast and light travel and stuff. I just think it's just so sick. Like I can already think of cool ways that he could apply that magic system to
Yeah.
modern technology, and that excites me,
Mhm.
because I know there's stuff that I can. Well, actually, I guess this kind of leads a little bit into my series. My books, like the magic system, is very like real world science inspired,
Mhm.
and I have kind of done that intentionally because I like the idea that science can inform us about amazing things that we're not privy to, um, without looking into the science, right? So,
Yeah.
as an example, um, bioluminescence is kind of like one of the driving factors in my magic system, and it's something that ever since I was a little kid, I've kind of been obsessed by. Like seeing glowworms and stuff like that just used to just blow my mind. Like, how are these things creating light?
Right.
Um, and so I think there's really cool things you can do with this stuff, because it nearly does border on the supernatural or on the magical, right? And so you can kind of exploit that for your storytelling. And that's, I think, where the boundaries between sci-fi and fantasy actually start to cross over.
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, just imagine like, what if like Lord of the Rings all of a sudden, like how many ages does it take before they go into space? You know what I mean? Like that's
Yeah.
such a crazy concept.
See,
Um,
that's wild to me.
yeah,
That's like, who would be doing that as well? Like the elves? Like, like,
right.
like who would be common? Like, yeah, I can't even. Yeah.
Yeah, there's a movie came out on Netflix a few years ago. I think Will Smith was the lead guy in it. Um, I don't even remember what it's called. It wasn't like a super great movie, but the concept was really cool. And it was basically like elves and orcs and fairies and all
Oh,
that, but it was like in modern time, like today, like
yes.
2024. I don't remember
I
what it was
forget the name
called,
of that
but
film. Yeah,
it wasn't
I know
like
exactly what you're talking about.
yeah, I watched it and I was like I the movie itself was not really that great, but like the concept to me was so cool that I just overlooked the whole like the story doesn't work kind of a thing. But it was
Yeah,
really
I'm trying to
good.
remember what that's called. I'm not going to be able to remember now, I don't think.
Yeah.
But I remember when that came to Netflix and like the SFF like scene really blew up over it because it incorporated a lot of that stuff in like a modern context, which is just like it's just so cool. Like,
Yeah.
oh, Bright. It's Bright, isn't it?
Bright. Yeah, that's what it
Yeah,
was.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. It's so
Yeah.
cool. And
What a cool
Joel
concept.
Edgerton is the orc guy.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, that one
yeah,
was super cool. I I like also with Brandon Sanderson, I think the other thing to talk about with him is like the Cosmere is so interesting because he's not he's not interconnecting them so much that the world is collapsing on itself. So like you
yeah.
can
I think there's a
basically
risk of it.
but you
There's
can
definitely
read
a
like I
risk.
can just read the Stormlight archive. Like I don't have to
Yeah,
read the rest of them or you can just read Mistborn. Whereas a lot of franchises now it's like if you don't watch all the movies, if you don't read all the books and then you read the next series, you can't understand anything. And so I think that's smart of him.
yeah. It's super smart. I think it's also as I said before. I think it can lead to um, I guess potentially like some level of like dissatisfaction at the end of it all, where it's like, did this really amount to what I'd built up in my head from years of hype?
Yeah.
Like, I think there's always that risk.
Mhm.
And something I noticed, like when I read The Lost Metal, which was the last book in the second era that just wrapped up,
Mhm.
I did have a little bit of that feeling where I was like, man, now I'm kind of like, I don't know if I'm that keen that all of these worlds are starting to be so closely linked. Like I
Yeah.
kind of wanted it a little bit more, um, yeah, distant. But I do know what you're saying, and like at the moment, he's in a really good place because you can basically pick up any of those books as an entry point, and you don't
Mhm.
have to be a Cosmere nerd to enjoy the stories, and that I think is key.
Yeah.
Like if you look at the MCU,
Mhm.
they've kind of undone themselves a little bit since like the whole Thanos storyline. Like prior to that, it didn't matter if you've missed a story, you can kind of fill in the gaps. And if you didn't want to watch the Infinity War movies, then it doesn't really matter, you know? But
Yeah.
like now I feel like they're at the point where like I haven't seen really any films post Thanos just because it's so confusing and they all interact way too intimately and it's just
Yeah.
it's too hard to invest in.
Yeah, that's I just talked to someone about this. I have the Endgame poster back here,
Yeah,
and the reason I have it back there is because that's my like I was really big in the MCU like in the early phases, and
I was too.
so
Yeah,
yeah, I was like, I mean, I was going to midnight showings. I was about it, and then once Endgame happened, I kind of just was like, I'm gonna take these 22 or however many movies it is. I'm gonna go put it on the shelf, and I'm gonna be like, this is a perfect like. There's some,
yeah.
but as a whole, it's a
It's pretty
great.
good.
They
Yeah.
did a great job. Like Endgame is very satisfying because of all the stuff that came before it. So I was like, I'm just gonna put it over on the shelf and like that's good. Anything that happens next, I'll just whatever. And I think it's just collapsing on itself because, like you said, if you haven't watched everything before it,
Yeah.
you have no idea what's going on. You know?
And it's frustrating, especially when you're like a fan. Like, you know, like I've been a comic fan since day dot. You know, like my dad um and me used to read comics together all the time, and I've always been a massive Spider-Man and Batman guy. Like they've been my two, Marvel DC kind of like characters that I've just loved following for years.
Hmm.
And so, Spider-Man is like an auto watch for me. Like if there's a Spider-Man movie, I'll go see it.
Yeah.
Um, but I noticed when I saw the last one, I was like, man, like this was a great film, but also I feel a little bit out of it because I didn't see like the last like Doctor Strange or whatever, and
Hmm.
I don't have the context for the entire thing.
Yeah.
And so I guess it was a little bit lackluster when I actually left the theater, even though the movie in and of itself was like incredibly good, and I think it paid a lot of fan service and in a
Hmm.
really funny way, and so I completely agree with you. I completely agree with you.
Yeah. And then I think, for like writing and stuff, I think it's just something to that people got to keep in mind. Like I think
Yeah,
watching what happens with Marvel is a really good study case for writers in general to just pay attention to, of like, you got to make sure that you're connecting things correctly, but that people can jump in at any point. Like that, it's a very fine balance to find.
yeah, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's a really good way of saying it. Like it is a fine balance. And I think in writing we've got a bit of a benefit in that um you can stretch things out a lot more. Like in a movie
Hmm.
you've only got so much time to tell the story. And so therefore the crossover is also going to be so much more obvious.
Hmm.
Do you know what I mean? Whereas you can kind of
Yeah.
understate it a little bit more in the written word. So that's also an interesting kind of dichotomy there as well.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think with writing too, I think most people like, like you got in your head, like it's going to be a trilogy or a four books. Like, I've got like, I'm going to make these, I'm going to write this kind of series. So it's not so much this like, I don't think most writers start a project and then go, I'm just going to keep writing books
Yeah,
forever until
yeah,
I run out of ideas. Like, I think maybe
yeah.
the only kind of people would be like maybe James Patterson with like his mystery
I was just gonna
novels.
say
Like,
James Patterson.
yeah. But like,
Yeah,
but for him though, it kind of works because they're just kind of, they're
yeah.
not like, you have to know everything from every book to watch forward.
Well, they're all self-involved stories, right? Like sorry, self-contained stories. So yeah, there's a general through line. It's like that thing of like, NCIS will always be on television,
Yeah.
but it doesn't matter. Like you could pick up any season or even any episode and not have any knowledge of the characters and you'd be able to have some fun with it, and like that's cool.
What is your, if you could give like some really final advice, like what would be your best, one, two, or three things that you'd tell to anyone who's wanting to self publish, write a book, get into this whole thing?
Okay. Well, maybe I'll break it down into like um if you want to like I'll break it down into like a craft thing and then maybe like a I guess like a publishing thing which is somewhat limited knowledge just in the sense that I'm also new to it and learning, right? But
Hmm.
okay, let me think. So in terms of in terms of writing, I think for me it's got to be actually I don't even want to talk about craft. I think what I want to talk about is imposter syndrome,
Hmm.
because for me that's like the number one thing that's gonna stop you in your tracks. And like some people will call that writer's block, for example. But I mean, yeah, they're kind of part and parcel of the same thing. They might be slightly different. You might get writer's block for a different reason, but a lot of times for me, writer's block is caused directly by imposter syndrome, and I think it's really easy as a creative person to feel like what you're doing is not up to scrub with what already exists. Um, and secondary to that, creative people tend to be, I'm not all of them, I'm not generalizing, but they tend to be more kind of melancholic and thoughtful types of people. Um, and I guess also for us as writers, like our craft tends to be incredibly isolating, right? So there's kind of like a few facets there that can get in the way of progress. But
Hmm.
for me, like imposter syndrome is dangerous because I find it very easy to be I guess like slightly self-deprecating about whether my writing's actually decent or not. And um, it, like it's good to get external validation from people, but I think we need to learn that we don't need it. Like we just need to write.
Hmm.
And that's a really like that's so much easier said than done. So like it's not a solution, um, but I think one thing you can do is try to get positive feedback from other writers wherever possible.
Hmm.
Um, and you can kind of, like I do this with some of my author friends now, where it's like, um, I know that this scene's got problems, and I know that these problems are mostly A, B, and C. Um, can you tell me something about this scene that is working, just to help me like level my mind, and
Hmm.
someone will send back a message and say, "Oh yeah, dude, you did this really well. Like I understand it's got these problems, but you did this thing really well." Then I can look at it and go, "Okay, like I've actually got a springboard now to step from and conquer the challenge." Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Um, and I think also once we are published, there's also a tendency to not rely, but to maybe over focus on the reader noise, like the hubbub from what readers say about your book. But ultimately, readers will like your book, readers will not like your book, and it's just simply out of our control.
Hmm.
If you've put your book out there, you need to acknowledge that you are taking that out of your control. And I think once you allow yourself to feel like it's not in your control anymore, the reader noise kind of goes away. And so the imposter syndrome can be managed a little bit more effectively. So I guess like all of that said, I guess what I'm saying is try to make sure you've got a group of writers that you really trust, who can tell you things you can do to improve and help you constantly improve, because constant improvement is the only way to get better. It's the only way to be the writer that you want to be, but also have writers who can tell you what you are doing well, so you've got that sense of validation to keep you motivated.
Yeah.
Um, so that's probably like my craft feedback, which I guess kind of leaks a little bit into publishing as well. Um, because in terms of publishing, I would say like the number one thing that has helped me has been community.
Hmm.
Like I was very kind of nervous about self-publishing because I am a melancholic person and I'm a bit introverted, and I struggle with, doing like the whole social media thing, or, jumping on an interview and stuff like that. And I remember hitting up Scott Palmer, who's another indie author who just put out his first book 2 weeks ago, called A Memory of Song. Brilliant book, by the way. But I messaged Scott right when he and I were kind of at the same level. We had like 50 or 60 followers online, and we were trying to figure out a way to establish ourselves. And we actually got together and said, why the heck are we all doing this thing alone? Like,
Hmm.
why is everyone trying to do this thing alone? If we can do it with each other's help, we're all going to benefit from it. So we may as well do it with each other's help.
Yeah.
Yeah. So we
Right.
actually
Rising
created.
tide raises all ships, you know?
That's right. That's right. That's
Yeah.
exactly right. And we actually created a Discord. We called it the Break-ins, and we got a bunch of other authors on board. Um, and that has been the single best thing that we've done since day one. Like, it doesn't matter anything else that we've done, whether it's sourcing our cover artists or working with a really good editor. Like, obviously that stuff's all important for the book, but for you, for your sanity, for your drive, for the validation you need as a writer to keep doing what you're doing, you got to have a community. And like that's basically like my you know no compromising. You can't compromise on that.
Yeah.
You can try to do it alone, but at some point when you need the help, what are you going to do?
Hmm.
So yeah, that's kind of like that's what I would tell any new author to do, is just like put yourself out there. It's not easy, but everyone is really nice and willing to help. Um, and in turn, like, you pay it forward. I'm at the
Hmm.
point now where I've learned so much from so many incredible people. If anyone sends me a message and they don't know me, and plenty of people have, and they say, "Hey, I love what you're doing. Can you help me?" I will 100% help. Like, there's like, I think we need to remember that that culture does exist.
Yeah.
And you don't need to go alone.
Well, and we're not competing with each other. Like you're,
Yeah,
like you can be successful, I can be successful, everyone else out there could be successful. Like it's that abundance mindset of We can all
That's
do
right.
this, you know?
That's right.
Yeah.
And at the end of the day, like, we're all nerds. Like,
Yeah.
I love sci-fi fantasy.
Hmm.
I don't want there to be 5 sci-fi fantasy books coming out per month that are on the bookshelf. Like I want I want this industry to be flooded because it's a good thing. Like, you want to give people all that choice, and like so many people have untapped talents to tell incredible stories, and they're
Hmm.
too scared to do it for a lot of valid reasons. Um, but like, don't do it alone.
Yeah. Well, I think getting that feedback, I mean, the thing I would always, that I've had to really learn and would tell anyone is the faster you can get that feedback, the faster you're going to learn and the faster you're going to get better. So
Yeah,
put stuff out there as soon as you're comfortable, you know, because then you'll get
absolutely.
that feedback and then you can iterate and get better every time.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely right. And like, I found I was kind of putting myself out there really early on, even before the novella came out, and it was good because the novella had legs to stand on when it released, and that in and of itself gave me the motivation I needed to get book one done, especially when I got hit with the big rewrites and stuff like that. That really took a bit of the wind out of me at the start.
Hmm.
Um, a couple of weeks into that, I was like, oh man, this is hell. I'm trying to like reconstruct the whole beginning of my book. Okay, maybe I'm not a good writer, but
Yeah.
that's not what it is. You got to put it in perspective. And at the end of the day, I was able to look at, well, this novella's done this. I've got these statistics to prove it. I've got these people messaging me telling me that my book did this for them or made them feel this way. So that there are people out there who have seen it, they've heard it, they've felt what you've done. So you're a ripple. You're a ripple in the lake, so to speak,
Hmm.
and that matters.
Yeah,
That matters.
for sure. Well, man, this has been great and super grateful to talk to you about everything. And so, why don't you tell us where we can find y'all, where we can find your books, when the new book comes out, all that kind of stuff.
Absolutely. So, An Exile of Water and Gold comes out on September 3rd. You can pre-order it on Amazon now. You can also pre-order physicals. So I've got an online store. All physicals are signed. So if you jump onto my website, which is www.joshuawalkerauthor.com, there's a store link there that you can take a look at too. Otherwise, I'm on Instagram, and Twitter, and all the socials there as well. So, and if you look
Cool.
at the hashtag the break-ins, you'll see a lot of my posts that way too.
Awesome. Well, we'll put all that stuff in the description. And thanks everyone for watching this episode. We'll see you next time.
Thank you.